Hello everybody and welcome to the fourth episode of Radio Free Delingpole, broadcasting to you from occupied Europe. And today, by popular demand, we have as our guest Douglas Murray once more. Douglas, welcome.
Great to be with you again, James, and glad you're still free.
Douglas, I imagine, like me, you are feeling positively gutted by the death of that truly great leader, Kim Jong-il.
Absolutely, and I'm sure, like the rest of the world, sit with bated breath, wondering who will be the next leader.
Yes, well, of course, they're going to have open and free elections, aren't they? I would imagine.
There'll be primaries, there'll be caucuses, all the usual, I'm sure.
But it's funny, isn't it, that his death should follow hot on the heels of a genuinely great man, Václav Havel, who could not have been more opposite to Kim Jong-il.
Absolutely. The loss of Václav Havel, I think, is a serious blow to all friends of democracies and freedom. It's the loss of one of freedom's greatest advocates, one of its greatest heroes. Havel, I think, in recent years perhaps has been too little appreciated, actually, particularly by a younger generation who don't realise, I think, in many cases, the extraordinary power of this man. And, by the way, I should say, whilst we are commemorating him, also, among other things, a wonderful writer. A lot of people who've been mourning him in the papers today have not taken that, I think, sufficiently into account. He really was a master playwright.
I was reading about him in the obituaries. I mean, I knew something about it. I knew that he was part of the Velvet Revolution and so on. I didn't realise his background, that he came from a wealthy family of property developers, and as soon as the Soviet-backed regime took over, his family, his father had to work as a clerk, as Americans would call them. He was persecuted at school, so he had a very, very miserable life under communism. But he stuck to his guns. He wasn't going to become part of a system he despised. So he was always a dissident, and he ended up being sentenced to 4.5 years hard labour. And by that stage in his sort of career as a protester against the Czech regime, he was so loved that when he was in prison, the guards refused to give him a hard time because they respected what he was doing, his principles. But then when he got into political power, he didn't really know what to do with it. I mean, isn't this the problem with people of our persuasion, those of us who believe in small government? You know, Václav Havel, when he became president of the Czech Republic, he was sort of content to let the people make up their minds, to you know, whatever went. He wasn't going to fight for particular political principles because he didn't really believe in strong government. Is that a fair assessment?
I'm not sure it's an entirely fair assessment. I think that his genius really, apart from his writing, was as a transitional political leader. Right. I think a lot of transitional political leaders do find the period after transition difficult, for want of a better term. It's extremely hard also, of course. We've got to remember that when a society has been almost entirely wrecked, and when you see societies such as those that laboured under communist dictatorship, it's extremely hard to rebuild society like that. It isn't the work of a day, it isn't the work even of a year or a decade. It takes many decades, I'd argue, to fully come out of the kind of oppression which the Czech people laboured under. And I just think that it's always important to bear in mind, and I think one of the other things that we should reflect on after Havel's death is just that reminder of how swiftly societies do go back and forth across the freedom spectrum. I mean, you know, I was in the Czech Republic the other day, and you know, this is an ordinary working society now, but it isn't long ago at all that it wasn't. And you know, our memory spans, I think, particularly in the West these days, are so fantastically short. We remember things. We talk about epochs when we mean yesterday, and forget things that happened in half a lifetime.
Yeah, well, I think it's a sign of just how short our memories are that we are currently erecting in the European Union a system not unakin to the one that Václav Havel helped to bring down. You know, I mean, it's not very long ago that the Berlin Wall fell and all those Eastern European Soviet satellites collapsed and were replaced by democracies. And yet here in the EU, we have people like Mario Draghi, Angela Merkel, et al., the usual rogues gallery, trying to erect this new socialist superstate. I mean, what does that say about our general intelligence and understanding of history?
I think you're a little harsh on Angela Merkel in particular, who I think is bearing a burden at the moment that she doesn't want to bear, that Europe relies on Germany bearing, which Germany doesn't want to bear. The truth is that almost anything could happen in Europe at the moment. Political prediction is always a pretty ropey and rackety game. At any moment, people can be proved wrong or right. But I have to say that I think at the moment it's even worse than normal for anyone wishing to predict the direction of things. The European economic project is, as we speak, collapsing about our ears. And the European political project can't help but suffer as a result of that. And so as a result, every single country in Europe is being torn every imaginable way. Britain in particular, of course, but every country has this. We have been attempting for more than a generation to go through an extraordinary period which has been propelled not by economics and not by politics, really, but by simple ideology. And I think it's worth remembering that when people say, how could we have got here economically? I would say we didn't get here because of economics. We got here because of an ideology, which has just come apart as surely as it always was going to, because it was an ideology which was incapable of working.
Yes. Now, before we move on to American politics, I think we ought to pause briefly in Britain and discuss the ineffable, mystifying creature that is Nick Clegg, our Deputy Prime Minister. And I feel rather guilty about introducing this complete non-entity to American listeners. On the other hand, I think the presence of this man in our government as our Deputy Prime Minister is entirely indicative of just why David Cameron's coalition is going to be an absolute disaster for Britain. Number one, Douglas, you may have noticed that among those still clinging to this European ideal long after the rest of us have abandoned it is Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg still seems to believe that, you know, our place is in Europe, shackled to this corpse.
If I can say so, there is one very obvious reason for that, James. I've long held to it that the reason why Nick Clegg remains welded to this is because come the next general election in Britain and the massacre at the polls that the Liberal Democrats will get, the only way in which Nick Clegg could remain in any kind of employment is if he goes to Brussels and becomes a commissioner.
Yes, if there is
the job
a
market
Brussels
isn't
left.
open for him otherwise.
That's very true. I just wonder whether there will be a European Union left by the time they lose the next general election.
It would be a very beautiful thing indeed if Nick Clegg arrived in Brussels just as the place fell down.
It would be fantastic, wouldn't it? I don't know whether you've seen the other extraordinary thing that Nick Clegg said the other day. I mean, Nick Clegg's job seems to be in a way, the flack catcher, the great distraction that David Cameron uses to distract the electorate from his own inadequacies. So he'll always put forward Nick Clegg to say something really stupid. And Nick Clegg has just made this speech saying that the Conservatives should not be allowed to give tax credits to encourage people to get married. He said that we should not take a particular vision of the family institution, such as the 1950s model of suit-wearing, bread-winning dad and aproned homemaking mother, and try and preserve it in aspic. Well, I don't know about you, Douglas, but I think the model of the traditional family actually worked pretty well for Britain and America and those other countries that have tried this daring experiment over the years. And I don't really get what the benefits are of not encouraging people to get married. Maybe you can explain.
Well, there's a very straightforward explanation, if I can say so, James, which is that Nick Clegg doesn't have a political ideology left. His party doesn't have a point. Yes. The Liberal Democrats in any normal system would not survive. They wouldn't be alive. They'd be an extinct species. We would look at faked up versions of them alongside the dodo in the Natural History Museum at Oxford University. There is no such thing as Liberal Democrat politics, Liberal Democrat ideology, or Liberal Democrat core values. So, what do you do if you're in this unfortunate position of being a Liberal Democrat? You have to invent false and fake enemies. You have to pretend that there are organizations and individuals and parties and ideas out there against which you must fight and rail. And this makes you indeed, of course, not a mere pawn in a weak coalition government, but a colossus bestriding history. And so Mr. Clegg thinks of himself. And before he departs this country to go to Brussels, Mr. Clegg will be trying to set himself up in opposition to any number of false and unreal oppositions which he can discover, which he thinks will make him popular. This is a great example of it, because you see, there is nobody in Britain who thinks anymore that it is the best imaginable thing for a child to be brought up in a home without a mother or without a father. You recognise that there are situations that are unfortunate, all sorts of situations where people are brought up with only one parent. But the idea that you would propel that as your desired family structure is foolish beyond belief, and I don't believe there are vast movements of people who feel this. But here we get to the crucial thing. What Mr. Clegg does think is that there is a lobby in Britain of conservatives who believe that women should be in the home baking cakes, and that men should wear suits and go to work and raise money to pay for their own families. And that vision of Mr. Clegg, this vision is only in Mr. Clegg's mind. It doesn't exist in the minds of conservatives. But you see, what they want to do is to completely characterize conservatives. They want to pretend that when you say something about the family, you are, for instance, bashing gays, that sort of thing. Now, I mean, I wrote a piece recently in the Spectator magazine, to which, of course, we're both contributors, and I mentioned there that, there's a perfectly good argument, a conservative argument for gay marriage, which, fortunately, I have to say, is one of the few times I've ever written anything that has almost immediately been taken up by the Prime Minister as an argument, but it happily was. And I think that most, may he listen to these podcasts, James, but I think most conservatives do see the fact that you can, as a society, reward and encourage people who form lasting unions, that you should not have systems in your tax credits or anything else that encourage people not to make commitments in their